This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. Evelyn was a fragile woman, worn down by the years of marriage and motherhood. Her face had softened with age, her hair now graying at the temples. She carried herself like someone who had long given up on the idea of joy. Her eyes were tired, tired of looking after the house, tired of looking after her children, and most of all, tired of looking after Gary, who was a shadow of the man he once might have been. Evelyn had learned to keep quiet, to keep her thoughts to herself, her needs buried beneath layers. And then there were the children, 3 of them, Aaron, Lucas, and Lila. Aaron, the oldest, was a 14-year-old boy with an unsettling air of arrogance that made him seem older than his years. He was tall for his age, his shoulders broad and his voice deepening prematurely. But his eyes held a cruel, vacant glimmer, like someone who had seen too much without ever fully understanding it. Aaron took pleasure in tormenting his younger sister Lila, finding her vulnerability an easy target for his teasing. He made fun of her shy nature, her tendency to retreat into herself, to bury herself in her books and her thoughts, and for every moment she tried to push back, Aaron would simply push harder. Lucas, 2 years older than Aaron, was quieter, more reserved, but equally malicious. He had an unsettling calm about him, an air of someone who knew just how far he could push someone before they snapped. He would often sit in the corner, watching as Aaron bullied Lila, but never stepping in to stop it. It was as though he found some sort of perverse pleasure in watching her suffer, her vulnerability something to be exploited, dissected. The hot rage that Luke had put together burned up inside Lucas, making him mouthy and crabby. There were times, too, when Lucas would speak in a low voice, as if to encourage the cruelty, feeding into Aaron's aggression, suggesting things that Aaron hadn't even considered. He was the kind of person who hid his cruelty behind a thin veil of indifference, as though he were merely an observer, never the instigator, though his actions spoke otherwise. And then there was Lila, the youngest. At 12 years old, she was small, her slight frame always seeming to shrink further under the weight of her family's neglect. She had large, wide eyes that always seemed to be watching, observing, seeing things that others missed, but never sharing her thoughts. Her hair was a tangled mess of brown waves that fell into her face, and she wore oversized clothes, trying to hide her thin, pale body behind them. Lila was a girl who lived inside her own head, retreating into herself when the world became too much to bear. But her brothers didn't understand her silence. They thought it was weakness, something to be mocked and ridiculed. The teasing began innocently enough, a joke here, a shove there. But as the years wore on, the cruelty grew. Lila's isolation became her prison, her mind a labyrinth of frustration and bitterness. She spent hours alone in her room, reading books to escape, writing in her journal to make sense of the storm that raged inside her. But the house, with its creaking floors and groaning beams, never offered her peace. There was always a presence, an unspoken tension in the air, that made her heart race when the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. It was a feeling that something was always on the edge of breaking, something that no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone could feel. It wasn't just the teasing from her brothers that made Lila feel trapped. It was the house itself. The silence in those walls was suffocating, the way the house seemed to hold secrets, as if it knew more than anyone cared to admit. The house was always watching, listening, waiting. And sometimes, Lila swore that in the middle of the night, when she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she could hear faint whispers, as though the walls themselves were trying to speak. But when she would rise to look, there was nothing, just the echo of her own footsteps. But the whispers never stopped, and neither did the cold, creeping feeling that something was very wrong. As the days passed, the unease grew. The house felt heavier, darker. The air felt thick with the unspoken, the hidden. And all the while, Lila watched her brothers, watched her parents, watched the world outside, wishing she could find a way out of the suffocating grip of her family in the house that held them all in its grasp. But that day would come soon enough. It would come when the quiet would no longer be enough to stifle what had been building, when the pressure would break, and when the house's dark secrets would finally be exposed. The Turner house was about to give up its most terrifying secret. But not yet. Lila Turner was always a quiet child, not by choice, but by necessity. From the moment she could remember, her world had been one of silence, a silence that crept into every room of the house, curling into the corners like an ever-present shadow. Her parents, Evelyn and Gary, had built a life that was one of careful, calculated restraint. The walls of the Turner household were thick with tension, built on a foundation of unspoken words, unmet expectations, and the steady hum of discontent that filled every day. Evelyn had been young when she married Gary. He was charming then, full of promises and dreams that sparkled like the Oklahoma stars. But those dreams were soon eclipsed by the stark reality of marriage, and within a few years, the man she had married turned out to be a ghost of the man she once thought she loved. Gary was a heavy drinker, quiet but volatile, and his affection for her had slowly waned as the years dragged on. He retreated into his workshop, building nothing of significance but a lifetime of distance. He spoke little, only offering grunts or sharp comments that could cut through the thickest silences. Evelyn, too, became a shadow of her former self. She had been full of hope and life when they first married, but now she had little left to give. She buried her sorrow in small, mundane tasks, cooking, cleaning, filling the hours with hollow actions. Lila, in a way, was invisible in their eyes. She was the third child, the youngest, and seemed to be little more than a background character in the unfolding tragedy of her parents' marriage. She wasn't like her brothers. Aaron, with his boisterous energy and cruel sense of humor, and Lucas, who had a calm but terrifying ability to manipulate, they both were part of a world Lila had never understood. They had their place in the house, a place of command, of noise, of presence, but Lila was always on the fringes, a ghostly figure who floated through the days without being noticed. Her mother's gaze often passed over her as if she didn't see her, as if Lila was something less than a person, just a shadow in the corner, a quiet interruption to the chaos her brothers caused. For years Lila watched them, watched how her brothers tormented her, how they threw insults like stones, laughing when she flinched, finding joy in the fact that they could make her disappear with just a few well-placed words. Aaron was the worst. He was loud, cruel, and unrelenting, and his sneers always had a sharp edge to them. He would knock her books out of her hands, shove her into the walls, or simply mock her in front of their parents. Evelyn would only sigh and mutter something about boys being boys, while Gary, with his distant, hollow gaze, would retreat further into his workshop, as though it were more important to finish his half-finished projects than to deal with his children. Lila's hurt went unnoticed, her tears unheard. No one cared. Her refuge was in the quiet spaces, the places where she could hide from their eyes. She found solace in the attic, the only place where she could escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house. It was a small, cluttered space, filled with old furniture, discarded clothing, and forgotten memories. But to Lila, it was a sanctuary. She would climb the narrow staircase and sit by the dusty window, her eyes scanning the horizon. Outside, the land stretched out endlessly. Flat and unchanging, the silence outside mirrored the silence inside, the same oppressive, suffocating quiet. And then there was the journal. Lila had started writing when she was younger, long before her world had become so unbearable. She had written down everything, the things she couldn't say, the words she couldn't speak to anyone. She wrote about the loneliness, the pain, and the yearning for a different life. The pages of her journal became a refuge of their own, a place where she could express the thoughts and feelings that had nowhere else to go. It was in those pages that she found some sort of release. But even there, she was not safe. One afternoon, while she was writing in the attic, Aaron had discovered her journal. He had taunted her with it, reading her private thoughts out loud for Lucas's amusement. He made fun of her for being weak, for not having the strength to stand up to him. He had mocked her silently as she cried, as though her pain was a game. It was in these moments that Lila began to realize the depth of her isolation. No one would come to her rescue, not her parents, who had grown so numb they no longer saw the damage they were inflicting, not Aaron or Lucas, who enjoyed her suffering. She was nothing more than an inconvenience, a pawn in a game she had never agreed to play. The world outside the Turner household seemed to be a distant dream, something that didn't belong to her. She was trapped, caught in a life that was slowly suffocating her, unable to escape. The longer she stayed in the house, the more she felt herself eroding away, piece by piece. Her mother, Evelyn, had her own struggles. She had long stopped trying to fix the broken parts of her family. She had stopped speaking up, stopped offering comfort. She had nothing left to give. The years of disappointment had taken their toll, and Evelyn had retreated into herself, lost in the haze of what could have been. She had always hoped for more from Gary, more from her children, but she couldn't even pretend anymore. She moved through the house like a wraith, a shadow of the woman she used to be. Her love for her children, especially for Lila, had become a distant memory, if it had ever existed at all. Lila sometimes wondered if her mother even knew who she was anymore. And Gary, their father, had long since abandoned any pretense of fatherhood. His workshop was his escape, his solace, the one place where he could retreat from the noise of the house and shut out the pain of his failed marriage and fractured family. Gary had built walls around himself, literal and metaphorical, and now, even when he was in the house, he wasn't truly there. He never saw the cruelty Aaron inflicted on Lila, nor did he care about the silence that enveloped the house. So he was content to remain a distant, silent figure, too absorbed in his projects to notice the cracks in the foundation of his family. Lila's life became a series of these small, unnoticed moments. They added up, day after day, until the weight of them became unbearable. Each insult, each shove, each mocking laugh took its toll, and though she never showed it, the damage was deep. The isolation in her heart began to grow, and with it, something else. A coldness. It wasn't an anger she could voice, nor a sadness she could share. It was something that grew inside her, a quiet fire that burned with the same intensity as the house's suffocating silence. And as the days wore on, Lila realized something. She couldn't escape. Not physically, not mentally. She was trapped in that house, in that family, with no way out. It wasn't a life she could endure forever. The fragile balance in the Turner household, carefully maintained by silence, was about to break. And when it did, it would be with the same quiet intensity that had defined Lila's entire existence. Silent, unnoticed, but deadly. The house had always been quiet, but the stillness had become heavier in recent weeks. Each room, each corner, seemed to be filled with a suffocating pressure that nobody spoke about. The air itself was thick, like the weight of the years that had passed in this isolated place, and it seemed to be pressing in on Lila with a force that she could feel in her bones. She moved through the house like a shadow, her footsteps soft, careful, as if even the floorboards might betray her presence. She had learned to keep her thoughts hidden, her emotions buried deep, wrapped in layers of silence. It was the only way to survive. But that silence, that calm, had become a kind of mask, a facade that everyone wore, even though behind it, everything was starting to fray. The friction in the Turner house was palpable, lingering just beneath the surface, like a spark waiting for the right moment to ignite. Lila could feel it too. She could feel the tension radiating from her brothers, from her mother, from the very walls themselves. It was as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the monotony, to shatter the calm. And Lila knew, deep down, that when it happened, it would be the kind of break that couldn't be fixed. A break that would make everything before it seem like it never mattered. The day came in the early afternoon, when the heat outside hung heavy in the air, the kind of oppressive warmth that made it hard to breathe. The house was stifling, the windows shut against the world, and the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning, barely able to combat the heat that pressed in through every crack. It had been a slow morning, the family moving through the house with the kind of aimless energy that came from too much time spent in isolation. Evelyn was in the kitchen, standing at the sink and staring out the window, her gaze distant. Gary was in the workshop, as always, lost in the scent of wood and the sound of his tools grinding against each other. Aaron and Lucas were outside, though not for long. They had spent the entire morning teasing Lila, throwing taunts at her, trying to get a reaction. But Lila had learned long ago that giving them what they wanted was a mistake. She stayed silent, retreating into her room, away from their cruelty. But the silence in her room was starting to feel like a prison. Every day, the same thing. Every day, the same mocking laughter, the same disregard. The silence between the walls of the house had become a cage, one that was closing in around her, pushing her into corners where she could no longer breathe. Her thoughts were dark now, darker than they had ever been before. The isolation that had once been a comfort was now a torment. The quiet had become unbearable, and with each passing day, it felt like something inside her was dying, like a part of her humanity was being erased. She had tried to escape in small ways. She buried herself in books, in the pages of her journal, in the world that existed outside of the Turner house. But nothing helped anymore. She couldn't outrun the feeling that was growing inside her, a feeling that was colder than the air in the house, darker than the corners she had hidden herself in. It was a feeling of rage, of helplessness, of a slow burning hatred that had built up over the years of neglect, the years of cruelty, the years of being invisible. And so, as the heat of the afternoon pressed against the house, something inside Lila snapped. It was a subtle thing, a shift in her mind, a quiet decision made in the span of a heartbeat. She didn't plan it, it wasn't something she had consciously decided to do, but in that moment, the rage that had been building inside her found its outlet. She didn't think about what would happen next, about the consequences. She thought of her husband. She didn't think about the way it would change everything. All she knew was that something had to give. Something had to break. She could hear her brothers outside, the sounds of their footsteps moving around the yard, the occasional shout or laugh breaking through the window. They were planning something to torment her with, something to remind her of just how small she was in their world. But for the first time, Lila didn't want to run from them. She didn't want to hide in her room and wait for the storm to pass. No. This time, she wanted to face it. She wanted to break the cycle, to make it stop once and for all. Her heart pounded as she stood in the hallway, the noise of the outside world muffled by the thick walls. She could feel her pulse in her throat, in her fingertips, in her legs. The feeling was raw, primal, like the sensation of something wild waiting to be unleashed. The door to the yard creaked as it opened, and she stepped out, the heat of the sun bathing her skin. She didn't know where the strength came from, didn't know what part of her had finally decided to act, but she felt it all at once. A strange clarity, a dark kind of focus. Aaron and Lucas were by the old wooden fence at the edge of the yard, laughing at some joke only they understood. Lila stood still for a moment, watching them, feeling the knot of fear and rage tightening in her chest. They didn't see her approach. They didn't notice her until she was standing behind them, until the quiet step of her shoes on the dirt was swallowed by the laughter in the air. And when they finally turned around, when they saw her standing there, her face blank, her eyes cold, it was already too late. The moment she stepped forward, everything seemed to slow. Time bent under the weight of what was happening, as if the world itself were holding its breath. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all. The pent-up years of torment, the isolation, the unbearable weight of the house, all of it was wrapped in that single look. Aaron's mocking grin faltered for a moment, just a flicker of doubt crossing his features. But then, before he could speak, Lila moved. It was quick, calculated. The years of being invisible had taught her how to strike when no one was looking, how to break through the silence. Her hand was fast, and before he could react, she had him by the throat. Her fingers dug into his skin, and his eyes widened with shock and confusion. He gasped for air, trying to pry her hand away, but Lila was beyond reason now. The rage she had felt for so long surged through her, a tide she could no longer control. She didn't hear Lucas calling out to her, didn't hear the panic in his voice as he tried to pull her off. All she heard was the sound of Aaron's breath struggling in her grip, the way his eyes bulged in disbelief. His teasing had always been sharp, but this time the tables had turned. This time Lila was the one in control. She was the one who held the power, and then, with a final push, it was over. The air stilled. The world stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. The same silence that had followed Lila for so long, but this time, it felt different. It felt final. Lucas, too stunned to move, stood there frozen. His brother was limp in her hands, the life slowly draining from him. The air seemed to have thickened once again, but this time it was not with the weight of unspoken words. It was with the weight of something darker, something irreversible. Lila stood over them both, her chest heaving, her heart still pounding in her ears. It was over. They were over. And yet, as she stood there, the quiet of the world around her felt more deafening than ever before. This time, it wasn't just the silence of a house that had been hiding pain for years. It was the silence that came after the storm, after everything had been destroyed. And Leela knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. The quiet of the Turner house had stretched on for far too long, a thick and suffocating silence that hung over everything like a dark cloud. It was the kind of silence that clung to the walls, to the floors, and to the air itself, making it difficult to breathe. Lila had always felt its weight, but now it seemed to press against her chest with an unbearable intensity. The world outside her home was distant, cold, and uninviting, but inside the house, everything was locked in place, suspended in a moment that would never change. Until it did. The yard was still, the grass barely rustling in the wind. Aaron's body lay crumpled at her feet, his lifeless eyes staring up at the sky, his mouth open in a grotesque expression of surprise. Lila stood over him, her chest heaving, her breath quick and shallow. The pounding in her ears was deafening, but in that brief second of clarity, she could hear nothing but the beating of her own heart. The years of torment, the years of silence, the years of being invisible, everything had led to this moment. The weight of it crushed her, but there was no relief in it, no sense of justice. There was only the cold, final knowledge that what had been done could never be undone. Lucas, still frozen in place, hadn't moved. His gaze was locked on Aaron's still form, and for a brief moment, Lila wondered if he would be next. But there was no time to think about that. The seconds stretched out like an eternity, and as the world around her seemed to freeze, something shifted inside her. She wasn't sure what it was, whether it was fear or a primal need for survival, but the sensation of control, the sensation of being in command of the situation, was overwhelming. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel powerless. She didn't feel small. She felt enormous, as though she could crush the very air with her presence. But then, as if the gravity of the moment had caught up with her, the realization began to seep in. What had she done? What was this? The weight of her actions, of the blood on her hands, began to settle over her like a dark mantle. She glanced at the body at her feet, and the strange sense of control faded into something more horrifying, a sickening, crawling sensation in her gut. But it was too late to turn back now. The feeling of terror was instantaneous. A deep, gnawing fear began to coil around her spine, pulling her down, suffocating her with its grip. This was real. This wasn't some twisted fantasy she had concocted in her mind. Aaron was dead. He wasn't just the brother who had tormented her. He was a body now, cold and unrecognizable. She couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. It didn't take long for the numbness to slip away and the panic to flood her system. Her hands, still trembling from the force of what she had done, were slick with sweat and blood. She looked at Lucas, his wide eyes filled with terror. She had never seen him like this before. Normally so calm, so calculating, he was now a broken boy standing in the midst of a nightmare. His body seemed to shake, though he didn't move, didn't speak. He simply stared at her, his mouth open in disbelief, as though he were waiting for the world to right itself. But the world wouldn't right itself. Not now. In a flash, he realized how much more this could unravel. Lucas was there, standing at the precipice of it all. If he moved, if he screamed, everything would change. She could feel the seconds slipping away, and in those seconds, she knew everything hinged on him. He could either become her ally or become the weight that dragged her down into the abyss. She glanced down at her hands, the blood now darkening beneath her fingernails, and the world seemed to spin. The air, thick with heat, felt suffocating, pressing in on her. She took a step back, almost stumbling as the reality of the situation crashed into her. This wasn't just an act of rage, it was an irreversible decision. There was no coming back from them. But Lucas didn't move. His eyes never left her. But there was something in them now, a flicker of recognition. Recognition of what had happened. And in that moment, Lila knew what had to be done. Her legs moved before her mind could fully catch up. Her body seemed to act on its own, propelled by the primal, desperate instinct to survive, to cover up the mistake before it could completely consume her. She reached for the shovel lying discarded in the dirt near the fence, its rusted metal blade gleaming ominously in the dim light. It was an old tool, neglected and weathered, but in her hands it felt heavy with purpose. Lucas hadn't moved. He was still frozen, still staring at Aaron's body, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. It didn't matter. Lila didn't wait for him to process. She swung the shovel with all the strength she had left, her body fueled by terror and the crushing need for control. The blow landed hard, the sharp edge of the shovel crashing against the side of Lucas's head with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the ground, his body twisting unnaturally as it hit the earth, his mouth open in a silent scream. The world fell away for a moment, a blur of shapes and sounds. Lila couldn't remember how long she stood there, her hand still gripping the shovel, as she watched him fall. It was all so surreal, so detached from everything she had ever known. But in the center of it all, there was the undeniable fact. They were both gone. She had done it. She had ended them both. The weight of what she had just done settled heavily on her chest. But there was no time to feel the full depth of the horror. There was no time for regret, no time for guilt. If she allowed herself to feel it, to understand what she had taken from the world, she might crumble under the pressure. She might fall to her knees and never get back up again. And so, she pushed it all aside, burying the grief and the terror deep inside. For now, there was only the need to escape, to hide what she had done before anyone could see. Lina's mind raced as she turned, her thoughts a jumbled mess of frantic calculations. She needed to hide the bodies. She needed to clean up, to erase all evidence of what had happened. The house was still quiet, still locked in that oppressive silence. But the moment had changed. It wasn't the same anymore. It would never be the same. As she looked down at the bodies of her brothers, her heart twisted in a way she didn't fully understand. There was nothing left of them now. No teasing, no laughter, no life. They were nothing but corpses lying still and silent in the yard. They had tormented her for years, pushed her to the edge, and now they were gone. But the question lingered in her mind, gnawing at her from the inside. Was this really what she wanted? Was this the freedom she had imagined? The sound of her own breath, ragged and uneven, was the only thing she could hear now. It filled the space around her, drowning out everything else. Slowly, Lila began to walk away from the bodies, the shovel still in her hand, her footsteps heavy in the dirt. There was no going back. She knew that now. She didn't know what the future would hold, what the consequences of this moment would be. But for the first time in her life, the silence didn't feel so suffocating. It didn't feel like a prison. It felt like freedom. And as she disappeared into the shadows of the house, Lila realized that she had stepped over a line from which there would be no return. The house seemed quieter than ever in the hours that followed. After the events that had unfolded, the silence was almost suffocating, pressing in on every corner of the Turner home. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. The warm air had cooled, but the oppressive weight of what had happened hung over the house like a dark cloud, thick and impenetrable. There were no sounds of laughter, no raucous shouts from the boys that had once filled the space. Instead, there was nothing. Just the rustling of wind through the trees, the distant hum of streetlights flickering to life in the neighborhood. It was as though the world had stopped. Lila had spent the first few minutes in a daze, moving through the house like a ghost. Her mind felt foggy, as if the very reality of what she had done had not yet fully sunk in. Her legs were unsteady, her hands trembling. The blood was still there, staining her fingers, her skin, the shovel she had discarded in the corner of the yard. She couldn't look at it, couldn't bring herself to face the reality of what had just happened. The first set of boxer shorts they found had a list of categories for them, so they could go through. It was easier to pretend it hadn't, easier to go on as if nothing had changed. But even as she moved through the house, the sickening truth gnawed at her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. It was when Evelyn returned that the house seemed to shift. The door creaked open as the older woman stepped inside, her usual slow, methodical gait filling the space. She had been out all afternoon, visiting a neighbor, as she often did to escape the tension that lingered in the house. But as she crossed the threshold, the atmosphere seemed to change. The air felt heavier, thicker, charged with an invisible electricity. Her senses heightened, as if her body were subconsciously aware that something was wrong. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign. There was a sense of unease that crawled over her skin, making her uneasy. She couldn't place it. She just knew. Evelyn moved through the house in search of her sons, her gaze flickering between rooms, but she didn't find them. The house was disturbingly still. No sign of Aaron and Lucas. It was rare for them to be out of sight for long, especially after everything that had happened earlier in the day, after the cruelty that had been building for weeks. They weren't playing their usual games. They weren't lounging in front of the TV. It was as if they had disappeared. Her first thought was to check the yard, where she had seen them earlier, but something stopped her before she could reach the back door. There, in the corner of the hallway, was Lila. She was standing still, her back rigid, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Her expression was unreadable, blank, something that both frightened and unsettled Evelyn. She had never seen her daughter like this. Lila was usually the quiet one, the one who stayed in her room, who avoided conflict. But now there was something in her eyes, something dark and heavy. Evelyn didn't know what it was, but she felt it. "Where are your brothers?" Evelyn asked, her voice tentative. Lila didn't answer immediately. Her body was stiff, as though she were holding herself in place, trying to keep herself from moving. She stared at her mother for a long moment, her lips pressed tight together. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, a pang of something unnatural seizing her chest. There was something about her daughter's silence, something about the tension that had suddenly wrapped itself around her that sent a chill through her bones. "Lila," Evelyn pressed, stepping closer, her voice trembling slightly. "Where are Aaron and Lucas?" Still, Lila said nothing. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She moved toward the back door, her feet heavy, her mind racing. She didn't know why, but the instinct to check outside was overwhelming. When she opened the door and stepped into the yard, the first thing she saw was the disturbed earth, the freshly dug soil at the far edge of the yard, hidden beneath the shadows of the trees. Her stomach turned as she moved toward it, her every step heavy with dread. The unease that had begun to settle in her chest now exploded into full-blown terror. She turned to her eldest sister, a young man who'd been afforded her since the day her 11-year-old daughter was born. The scene that met her eyes was one she would never be able to forget. The bodies of her two sons lay in the dirt, their once lively faces twisted in shock, their limbs bent at unnatural angles. Blood stained the ground around them, seeping into the earth like a poison. Evelyn stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, her legs giving way beneath her as she collapsed to the ground. The sight of her children, her flesh and blood, lying dead before her was too much to comprehend, too much to bear. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her ragged breathing, her chest heaving as if she were drowning in the air itself. The world seemed to close in around her, and she couldn't think, couldn't move. Her mind scrambled to make sense of it, but it couldn't. This was a nightmare, a horrible, unspeakable nightmare, and she was trapped inside it. Then, as though her body had finally caught up with the devastation, her gaze shifted to Lila, who stood at the back door, her hands still clenched into fists. The girl's face was expressionless, her eyes empty, as though nothing had happened at all. Evelyn's heart stopped, the realization striking her with the force of a sledgehammer. It was Lila. She had done this. The cold, unfeeling look in her daughter's eyes was all the evidence she needed. A sharp, guttural scream escaped Evelyn's throat, but it felt distant, muffled, as if she were hearing someone else's agony. Her body shook with uncontrollable sobs, but they didn't seem to matter. The world was spinning, and she couldn't stop it. She reached for the phone in her pocket, but her hands were trembling too violently to dial the numbers. Her mind was clouded with disbelief, and yet the truth was undeniable. Her daughter, her sweet, quiet daughter, had killed them. Killed her sons. Lila stood in the doorway, her face emotionless, her eyes cold and empty. She didn't move, didn't speak, as if she were simply a witness to something that had no real consequence. And in that moment, Evelyn realized that whatever had been left of the child she had once known was gone. What stood before her was something else entirely. The silence that had once been a comfort in this house now felt like a prison, like an unshakable weight that pressed in from all sides. Evelyn could hear her heart beating in her ears, pounding in time with the fear and horror that had gripped her. This was not a family anymore. This was something broken. Her breath hitched as she looked back at Lila, her mind reeling with the impossibility of it all. How had it come to this? What had happened to her daughter? But there was no time to ask. The reality of the situation was already consuming her, like fire devouring dry wood, and there was no escaping it. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to grow louder. The nightmare was far from over. But as Evelyn gazed at her daughter, she knew that whatever came next, whatever happened in the aftermath of this discovery, it would never undo the terror that had been unleashed in the quiet house in Oklahoma. The air in the Turner house had become suffocating, thick with the smell of blood and fear. The silence that had hung heavily over the house was now broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind against the windows, as if the world outside was trying to escape the suffocating horror inside. Lila stood at the center of it all, her feet rooted to the floor, her gaze distant. She had crossed a line, a point from which there would be no return, and the gravity of it was now settling over her like a shroud. Her heart thudded in her chest, but it was a hollow sound, empty, devoid of feeling. The discovery of her brother's bodies had sent the house into a frenzy, but Lila remained eerily calm. The chaos around her, the sirens, the shouting, the flashing lights outside, seemed like a world far away, something she had no part in. She had always been a quiet, unnoticed presence, but now, standing amidst the wreckage of her past, she was someone different. But instead of disgust or fear, all she felt was a strange, gnawing emptiness, as if something inside her had been severed, and in its place was nothing but a void. The officers arrived, their faces grim, their eyes cold with the knowledge of what they were about to uncover. But it didn't matter to Lila. She could see their movements, their hushed conversations, their frantic attempts to piece together the pieces of the tragedy. But it was all distant, like watching a scene unfold in a movie, unable to grasp the reality of it. She was beyond their reach now. Lila was already slipping into something else, something far darker than anyone could comprehend. The shock of the event had cracked open a door inside her, one she hadn't known existed, and now, with the floodgates wide open, there was no turning back. The girl who had once been quiet, ignored, had become something unrecognizable. Her gaze drifted to the shadows, where the memory of her brother's bodies lingered. But it didn't bring the remorse that should have followed. Instead, there was an unspoken resolve, a chilling certainty that this path she had chosen was her own, and she would walk it alone. As the authorities closed in, as the world around her fractured into accusations and despair, Lila's mind wandered to a darker place. She could almost feel the weight of the past, the years of neglect, the endless taunting, the weight of a family that had never understood her. She wasn't just running from her brothers or her mother, but from the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. With every passing moment, the house seemed to fade into the background, its walls no longer familiar. She felt no connection to the place, to the people who once inhabited it. There was only her, Lila, walking further down a path she could never undo.